July 19, 1941. In southern Poland, near the town of Auschwitz, the gates of hell on earth have been flung wide open. The air is hot, stifling. On the dusty roll call square of the concentration camp, as the sun beats down mercilessly, thousands of men are lined up. They look like ghosts. They have no names. They have no pasts. They have no futures. They are now just numbers. Silence is the most terrifying noise here, because silence is the moment death makes its choice. News had broken that a prisoner escaped from Block 14, and that deadly silence deepened. The camp's rules were brutal and simple. For every one person who escaped, 10 of those left behind would be condemned to the starvation bunker to die. The camp commandant, Karl Fritsch, walked slowly along the front of the line, his finger choosing the victims. 1, 2, 3. When the count reached a Polish sergeant named Franciszek Gajowniczek, the most primal, painful reflex of human nature took over. The man collapsed to his knees and wailed, "Oh, my wife, my children!" That scream could have echoed off the gray walls of Auschwitz and faded away, just like thousands of other screams. But in that moment, something happened that shifted the course of history. Something that defied the laws of physics, the instinct for survival, and the cold, hard logic of the camp. An ordinary man stepped out of the line. He was frail, spectacled, a man struggling to breathe with lungs ravaged by pneumonia. The tattoo on his arm read 16670. He stood before Commandant Fritsch. He was calm, so calm in fact that his very posture was an act of rebellion. The commandant was stunned. For a number to dare to speak meant death. "What do you want?" Fritsch snarled. Number 16670 looked the commandant in the eye and made that historic offer. "I offer to die in this man's place. He is a father. I am." The commandant asked, "Who are you?" The answer was like a slap in the face to the entire ontology of Nazism, a system programmed to erase humanity. The man didn't say his number. He didn't state his military rank. With a single sentence, he reclaimed every ounce of identity that had been stolen from him in that second. "I am a Catholic priest." This man was Maximilian Kolbe, and this moment was no coincidence. It was the final, bloody signature on a mysterious agreement made exactly 35 years prior, when he was just a small boy. To understand the story, we must rewind time to the dawn of the 20th century. In 1894, in Russian-occupied Poland, a child named Raymond Kolbe is born. We see a mischievous, energetic boy born into poverty, piety, and suppressed nationalism. However, the event that changed Raymond's life happened when he was just 10 years old, around 1906, in a dim corner of their home. This was no simple childhood dream. It was an existential founding moment that mapped out his entire psychological and spiritual landscape. By his own account, the Virgin Mary appeared to him. In her hands, she held 2 different crowns. One was dazzling white, the other was blood red. Mary asked the boy, "Which of these crowns are you willing to accept?" The symbolism was powerful. The white crown represented perseverance in purity, in unsullied dedication. The red crown pointed to a much heavier price: martyrdom. How do you explain a 10-year-old choosing a crown symbolizing death instead of shiny toys or candy? But little Raymond gave an answer that revealed the depth of his soul even at that age. He didn't choose the white, he didn't choose the red. "I told her I would accept them both." That night, Raymond's destiny was sealed. He was no longer just a child, but a future martyr and saint. This vision transformed him from a passive believer into an agent actively choosing his own fate. The rest of his life would be spent managing the tension between these two crowns. The white crown would shape his theology and the massive organizations he would build. The red crown would prepare him step by step for that final end in Auschwitz. Fueled by the fire of this vision, Raimund, now having entered the Franciscan order and taken the name Maximilian, was sent to Rome for his education. But his years in Rome weren't spent merely among the dusty shelves of libraries. Here, he encountered a flesh and blood enemy that threatened his white crown. The year was 1917. While the world was drowning in the bloody trenches of World War I, the streets of Rome had become the front line of another war. Under the guise of celebrating the 200th anniversary of Freemasonry, aggressive demonstrations were being held against the Church and the Pope. Young Maximilian watched in horror as angry crowds marched beneath the windows of the Vatican. The slogans on their banners shook his pious heart to the core. Satan will rule in the Vatican, and the Pope will be his slave. The demonstrators carried brazen symbols depicting Saint Michael the Archangel being crushed by Lucifer. This scene was a breaking point for Kolbe. While many closed their curtains in fear and prayed, he was filled not with rage, but with strategic determination. He asked himself that famous question: is it possible that our enemies make such a show of force to defeat us while we fold our hands and do nothing? After all, do we not possess much more powerful weapons? Kolbe saw it as treason for goodness to remain silent and passive in a world where evil was so organized, so loud, and so audacious. His answer came quickly. On October 16, 1917, just days before the Bolshevik Revolution shook Moscow, in a monastery room in Rome, Maximilian Kolbe and 7 young friends gathered together. They had no guns in their hands. There were no military maps on the table. Their goal was to establish a spiritual army they called the Militia Immaculatae, Knights of the Immaculata. This was a movement to fight against the spread of modernism, secularism, and what they identified as the disbelief of the era through total consecration to the Virgin Mary. Kolbe's strategy was simple but revolutionary: to win the world for Christ. But he wouldn't do it with medieval methods. He would use the weapons of the modern age. Was the enemy using the printing press? He would use it too. Was the enemy organizing? He would build an even bigger network. The white crown was no longer just a symbol of personal purity. It had transformed into the banner of a global mission. When Kolbe returned from Rome to Poland, his mind wasn't filled just with prayers, but with the roar of printing presses, radio waves, and plans for a media empire that would reach millions. But no one could have guessed that this young, sickly priest would, in a few years, build the largest publishing complex in Europe and even carry his mission to the other side of the world, to Japan. And of course, the dress rehearsal for the apocalypse awaiting him there. This was the rise of the Knights of the Immaculata, but the Red Crown was waiting patiently in the shadows for its turn. When Maximilian Kolbe returned from Rome, the white crown in his mind was no longer just ethereal purity. It was the roaring sound of an engine. In 1927, looking out over an empty plot of land near Teresa, west of Warsaw, he saw only mud and bushes. But in his mind's eye, one of the greatest spiritual factories the modern world had ever seen was rising. He named this place Niepokalanów, the City of the Immaculate. This place looked nothing like the classical monasteries we know, quiet, detached from the world, filled with candlelit chants. Yes, the friars still wore their habits, they still prayed, but immediately after their prayers, they manned massive printing presses equipped with the latest technology of the era. Kolbe had analyzed the weapons of the enemy he saw in Rome very well. If modernity used technology to spread disbelief, Kolbe would consecrate that same technology to spread faith. Modern media tools, which many religious figures shunned as the devil's handiwork or worldly, turned into weapons of evangelization in Kolbe's hands. In a short time, Niepokalanów evolved into a massive, self-sufficient industrial complex. The monastery's population reached 700 friars and workers. They had their own fire department, their own power plant, even railway connections. The presses ran non-stop, printing the Rycerz Niepokalane, Knight of the Immaculata magazine, with a circulation reaching hundreds of thousands, eventually millions. Kolbe's vision wasn't limited to paper. In 1938, the monastery launched its own shortwave radio station. He even went a step further, planning to build a film studio to produce religious movies. He was one of the first religious strategists to realize the power of media in the spiritual war against evil and to use it with the discipline of a systematic army. But Poland wasn't enough for Maximilian Kolbe. His goal was to win the whole world, and that goal pushed him to place his finger on a point far to the east on the map. In 1930, with only a few friars by his side and almost no money in his pocket, he set off for a country whose language and culture he did not know, Japan. It was an adventure that defied logic. To many, it was madness. But for Kolbe, it was an act of limitless trust required by the White Crown. When he arrived in Nagasaki, a city famous for Japan's Catholic history, he began looking for a place to establish his mission. And it is right here that he made the most mysterious, most criticized decision of his life, one that years later would be hailed as divine genius. To build his monastery, he chose a steep slope on Mount Hiko-san in the Hongochi district, far from the center of Nagasaki. The locals and other missionaries were baffled. This land was strange. It was far from the city, difficult to access, and faced the mountain. Why would a missionary who wanted to reach people hide behind a mountain? But Kolbe was stubborn. The reason he chose this plot wasn't military strategy or a prophecy. The reason was much simpler: Franciscan poverty. This was the cheapest, least desirable land in the city. It was near a cemetery, and no one wanted it. Kolbe, faithful to his order's principle of poverty, chose the humblest spot. He named the monastery Muginzai no Sono, Garden of the Immaculate, and, repeating his success in Poland, began publishing the Japanese version of his magazine, Seibo no Kishi. However, the true value of this cheap and backward location would only be understood years after Kolbe had left, on one of the darkest mornings in human history. Date: August 9th, 1945. Time: 11:02 a.m. Maximilian Kolbe had long since returned to Poland and donned the martyr's crown, but the legacy he left in Nagasaki faced a horrific test that morning. The American B-29 bomber Boxcar dropped the atomic bomb nicknamed Fat Man through the clouds onto the city. The bomb detonated over the Urakami Valley. The Urakami Cathedral, the Catholic heart of the city and the largest cathedral in East Asia, was only 500 meters from the hypocenter. The cathedral and the believers inside were vaporized in seconds. The city was flattened. Tens of thousands burned to death. But when the dust clouds settled, an incredible scene emerged on the side of the mountain. Kolbe's Muginzai no Sono monastery was still standing. Yes, the windows were shattered, but the building was structurally sound. The friars inside were alive. How could it be? While the city's grandest cathedral was obliterated, how did this humble monastery survive? The answer lay in Kolbe's strange choice of location. The monastery was situated on the reverse slope of Mount Hiko-san. The mountain acted as a massive shield, protecting the monastery from the atomic bomb's devastating thermal and pressure wave. Years later, people called this Kolbe's prophecy. They claimed he foresaw the bomb. But monastery archives and witnesses say the truth is deeper. Kolbe hadn't seen the future. He had simply remained faithful to a spiritual principle: poverty. This choice, which seemed bad by worldly logic, cheap land, became the key to salvation in divine logic. Kolbe's spiritual fidelity had created a material miracle. Immediately after the bomb, the monastery transformed into a sanctuary and hospital for the wounded and dying. But Kolbe never saw this miracle with earthly eyes, because in 1936, due to failing health, he had to leave the Garden of the Immaculate and return to Poland, to his true destiny. When he returned, dark clouds were gathering over Europe. Although he tried to broadcast messages of peace from his radio station, Nazi Germany's tanks were approaching the border. That massive media machine at Niepokalanów would soon fall silent, giving way to a very different mission, the mission of saving human lives. Kolbe's white crown had completed its task. Now it was time for that terrible red crown, and that crown was waiting for him at the gates of Auschwitz. When the pages of history turned to September 1st, 1939, the massive gears turning in Maximilian Kolbe's City of the Immaculate ground to a halt. The rhythmic, reassuring sound of the printing presses ceased. In its place came the wail of sirens and the sky-tearing roar of German Luftwaffe planes. When the Nazis entered Poland, Kolbe had two choices. He could either close everything down and flee to safety, or he could transform this spiritual fortress he had built into a fortress of refuge. Without hesitation, he chose the latter. The colossal buildings that had printed millions of magazines for years instantly transformed into a massive refugee camp. Kolbe threw the monastery gates wide open. Inside poured not just Poles, but also the very people Nazi ideology viewed as vermin and had sworn to exterminate, Jews. The corridors of Niepokalanów no longer echoed with chants, but with fearful whispers. Kolbe and the few friars who stayed behind provided food, shelter, and most importantly, hope to nearly 3,000 refugees. In occupied Poland, this was the most dangerous way to say to the Gestapo right under their noses, "I am here and I do not bow to your hatred." Moreover, Kolbe did not stay silent. Though his printing presses had been confiscated, he continued to produce anti-Nazi publications through underground activities. "Truth is one," he said, "and the truth is stronger than hatred." But totalitarian regimes never forgive those who speak the truth. The inevitable end came on a cold February morning. On February 17, 1941, black-coated Gestapo agents arrived at the gates of Niepokalanów. For Kolbe, this was no surprise. That morning, he was as calm as if he were invited to a reception. There was no fear in his eyes as he said goodbye to his friars. He simply said, "Trust in the Immaculate Mother." When they took him away, he left behind not just an orphaned monastery, but a destiny waiting to be fulfilled. First, he was thrown into the notorious Pawiak prison in Warsaw. This was a waiting room ruled by torture and uncertainty, but the true hell awaited him in May. May 28, 1941. When the doors of the train cattle cars opened, Kolbe and hundreds of prisoners were greeted by a stench that burned the throat and the sound of barking dogs. This was Auschwitz, the place where that mocking sign, "Arbeit macht frei," work sets you free, hung over the gate. The purpose of this camp was not just to kill people. Before killing them, the Nazis did something far more terrible. They stripped the humanity right out of the human. When Kolbe stepped off the train, that black Franciscan habit, the sacred garment he had worn his whole life, was brutally ripped away. His head was shaved. A striped, filthy prisoner uniform was thrust into his hands. And then, one of the greatest shames in human history took place. A Nazi officer used a needle to tattoo a number onto Kolbe's left arm, 16670. He was no longer Father Maximilian. He was not a respected publisher, an intellectual, or a superior general. He was just number 16670. The camp's ontology, its philosophy of existence, relied on this: erase the individual, leaving only a pile of flesh that obeys. But there was one thing the Nazis hadn't calculated. You can take a man's robe, you can take his name, you can shave his hair, but you cannot touch his soul if that soul belongs to another place. Number 16670, amidst the heavy, muddy, bloody routine of the camp, continued to live, shockingly, as Father Kolbe. While carrying stones, while being beaten, or during those endless roll calls, he was still a priest. At night, in the stifling air of the barracks, while prisoners groaned in despair, Kolbe would crawl from his bunk to their side. He would hear confessions in secret, whisper sermons to them. He would give his own meager ration of bread to those hungrier than himself. When the guards looked at him, they didn't see a prisoner full of hate and curses. They found a man with a strange peace, looking at them with compassion. And that look drove them mad, because in that gaze, there was an authority stronger than all the weapons and power they possessed. When we looked at him, we felt that this was not the final stop of hell. Kolbe was keeping the promise he made to Mary as a child. He was wearing the white crown, purity and dedication, even in the mud of Auschwitz, the filthiest place on earth. But as July 1941 arrived, the air over the camp grew heavy. The heat was unbearable. Hunger was turning men into ghosts, and the gears of fate had begun to turn for that final scene of the Red Crown. One morning, a count in Block 14 came up short. One person had escaped. Sirens wailed, dogs barked, and all the prisoners of Block 14 were herded to that terrible penal square. The sun was high, and Commandant Fritsch had his finger of death ready. Number 16670 was in the line. Soon, he would make the final move to save the honor of humanity. The July sun poured down on Auschwitz like molten lead. The prisoners of Block 14 had been standing at attention for hours, motionless. Hunger, thirst, and fear had cast the mask of death over every face. The camp's most ruthless rule was in effect that day: collective punishment. It was determined that a prisoner from the block had escaped. To the Nazis, it didn't matter who the escapee was. What mattered was the terrifying lesson to be taught to those who remained. The rule was absolute. For every one person who escaped, 10 innocent prisoners selected at random from the same block would be sent to the starvation bunker. This was a fate far worse than the firing squad or the gas chamber. This meant rotting away in a dark, airless concrete cell without a drop of water or a crumb of bread, slowly going mad as you died. Camp Commandant Karl Fritsch walked slowly along the ranks in his polished boots. Every step he took struck the prisoners' hearts like a sledgehammer. He raised his finger and began to point randomly. You, you, you. When the Count reached a Polish sergeant in his 40s named Franciszek Gajoniczek, Fritsch pointed his finger at him. In that moment, Gajoniczek's world collapsed. Beyond the fear of death, the pain of the loved ones he would leave behind seared his heart. His knees gave way, and he let out that scream that tore through the camp's silence. "Oh, my poor wife, my poor children, I shall never see them again." This plea could have softened even hearts made of stone, but not a single muscle moved on Fritsch's face. As the soldiers dragged Gajowniczek to join the death group, a movement occurred that defied the laws of physics. There was a stir in the back rows. A man, thin, glasses broken, cheeks sunken, stepped out of the line. Under camp rules, this was suicide. The penalty for breaking ranks was immediate execution. But number 16670, Maximilian Kolbe, walked with a strange authority. His steps were so determined, his gaze so calm that the guards froze. No one pulled the trigger. Kolbe walked straight up to Commandant Fritsch, took off his cap, and stood tall. Fritsch was baffled. "What does this Polish pig want?" he shouted. Kolbe replied in a calm, clear voice, "I offer to die in that man's place." The commandant couldn't believe it. In Auschwitz, where everyone sold their bread and their honor to live 1 minute longer, was this man voluntarily asking for death? He pointed to Gajowniczek crying on the ground and asked, "Why?" Kolbe looked at Gajowniczek. "He is a father and has a family. He needs to live," he said. Then he turned to Fritsch. The commandant, trying to make sense of this inexplicable sacrifice, asked, "Who are you?" The answer was not just a statement of identity, but the ultimate bomb thrown at the Nazi project of dehumanization. "I am a Catholic priest." With this sentence, Kolbe refused to be a number, 16670. He shouted his faith, his vocation, and his humanity into the face of his executioner. And miraculously, Fritsch accepted the offer. Perhaps out of shock, perhaps out of curiosity to see how this strange priest would die. Gajowniczek was pushed back into the line. Kolbe joined the other 9 victims. The exchange was complete. The 10 men were shoved into those dark cells in the basements of Block 11. The doors were locked behind them. There was no food, no water, no light, only damp walls and the cold breath of death. Normally, only curses, screams of men attacking each other, and finally, the silence of madness would be heard from these cells. The guards were used to this. But this time, completely different sounds began to echo through the corridors of Block 11. Hymns were rising from the cell. Father Kolbe had turned that pit of death into a cathedral. He told the prisoners not to be afraid. He prayed with them, leading them in hymns to the Virgin Mary. Bruno Borgowitz, the cell's guard, would describe his astonishment in his testimony years later. Every day, the sound of prayer came from the cell. It was as if it were a church, not a dungeon. Days passed. One by one, the prisoners died. But even as they died, they were at peace. Kolbe held their hands until their last breath, consoling them. 2 weeks passed, 14 full days of hunger and thirst. In conditions where a normal human would die in 3 to 4 days, Kolbe was still alive. The other 9 had lost consciousness, but he was still sitting up, still praying. When the guards looked inside, they began to feel afraid of this man, looking back at them with clear, lucid eyes. The Nazis' patience had run out. The cell was needed for new victims, and this stubborn priest had to die. On August 14, 1941, an executioner was called from the camp infirmary. In his hand was a syringe filled with carbolic acid, phenol. This was a toxic fluid that stopped the heart instantly. When Kolbe saw his executioner, he didn't resist. He didn't flee. He simply extended his left arm, the arm bearing the number 16670, as if offering a gift. As the needle entered his vein, there was no pain on his face, only deep peace. The dream of the red crown he had seen as a child had finally come true. He had kept his promise to Mary. He had preserved both his purity, the white crown, and embraced martyrdom, the red crown, by giving his life for love. When he breathed his last, it was the eve of the Feast of the Assumption of Mary. It was as if the Immaculate had chosen that day specifically to welcome her faithful knight home. His body was removed from the cell, burned, and his ashes scattered to the wind. But the fire Kolbe lit did not go out. On the contrary, the love rising from that cell would cross the barbed wire, spread to the whole world, and trigger a theological earthquake years later that would lead a pope to declare him the martyr of the century. Now, only one question remained. If a man died not strictly for his faith, but purely for love, could he be considered a true martyr? As the Church sought the answer to this difficult question, the world was only just beginning to understand how massive Kolbe's legacy truly was. When 1945 arrived, Soviet armies entered Auschwitz. The scene they encountered left a wound in the conscience of humanity that would never heal. Behind the barbed wire were thousands of dead, and just as many living dead. But among those living dead, there was one who had survived miraculously. Franciszek Gajowniczek. The man for whom Father Kolbe gave his life had managed to survive the hell of Auschwitz, the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and the death marches. When he gained his freedom, his first task was to track down the stranger who had saved him. When he was reunited with his wife, though his sons had died in the war, he knew that the price of every breath he took, every bite he ate, had been paid by number 16670. Gajowniczek dedicated the rest of his life to a single mission: to travel the world and tell Kolbe's story, saying, "He died in my place." He was Kolbe's living monument of martyrdom. However, Kolbe's legacy wasn't limited to saving one man's life. His death ignited the fuse of a centuries-old theological debate in the highest offices of the Catholic Church. Maximilian Kolbe's action was undisputedly heroic, but was it martyrdom according to church law? This question caused a major crisis in the corridors of the Vatican. According to traditional theology, for someone to be considered a martyr, their killer must have killed them out of hatred for the faith, odium fidei. In other words, they had to say, "You die because you are a Christian." But Kolbe's situation was different. The Nazis didn't kill him because he was a priest, but because he was a random victim swapped for a runaway. He died not for dogma, but for charity, that is, for love of another. That is why, at his beatification ceremony in 1971, Pope Paul VI could only declare him a confessor rather than a martyr, his hands tied by canon law. Although the Pope unofficially gave him the title Martyr of Charity, in the official records, he still appeared not to have fully worn the red crown. History was waiting for another Pole to correct this injustice, Karol Wojtyła, known to the world as Pope John Paul II. On October 10, 1982, St. Peter's Square was packed. In the front row of the crowd, an old white-haired man waited in tears, Franciszek Gajowniczek. He had lived long enough to see the day his savior would be declared a saint. When the ceremony began, all eyes were on Pope John Paul II. Despite the established rules of the Church and the report of his own theological commission, which stated, no, technically he is not a martyr, the Pope made a revolutionary decision. In his homily, the Pope delivered that historic sentence: "I have decided that Maximilian Maria Kolbe shall henceforth be venerated also as a martyr." This was not just a change of title, it was a redefinition of the concept of hatred for the faith, odium fidei. The Pope declared that Nazism's systematic hatred aimed at destroying man was in fact hatred for God and the dignity of the human being he created. By defending a man's right to live, Kolbe had actually defended the most fundamental truth of the faith. To love a human being and die for them was the supreme witness of faith. That day, Kolbe officially wore his red crown. In a gray world of hate, he proved that love is redder and more vibrant than blood. Today, when we look at the story of Maximilian Kolbe, we see how the dream that little boy saw in 1906 was completed in a perfect circle. The white crown, purity, technology, media, and that limitless dedication to Mary. The grand vision he built in the printing houses of Neapoleonov and the mountains of Japan. And the red crown, that final crown of victory worn in the dark, urine and death-scented starvation cell of Auschwitz. With his last breath, Maximilian Kolbe taught us that being human is not just about breathing in and out. Being human is the ability to say you for someone else, even in a place where saying I is forbidden and everyone is reduced to a number. Number 16670 died in the body, his ashes mixed with the wind, but that wind still whispers to us today. Even in the darkest place in the world, if you have the courage to love, there is light. Where hatred thinks it has spoken the last word, love always speaks one more sentence. And Maximilian Kolbe's sentence will echo forever. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. John 15:13.